Sure, happy to. My name is Gabriela Morato. I am one of the deputy heads of the environmental and social risk management team at UK Export Finance. We are the UK's ECA. I've been working at the ECA for nearly a decade now at UCAF, and previously I spent a bit over a decade in consulting with a background in environmental and environmental engineering, and with a little bit of work as well with DFI back in the day. So move on.
Hi there. My name is Kara Stoker. I am with the DZ Bank in Germany on the export and agency team there. I handle E&S risk management on our transactions. I've been at the bank for almost 3 years, and I come from Euler Hermes, where I was on the sustainability team, also looking at projects, E&S management. And my background before that is in E&S consulting, and my academic background is in engineering. Thanks.
Hi everyone, I'm Sophie Sinclair and I work for Marsh, which for anyone who doesn't know is a global broker with specialty practices. So I sit within credit specialties. And while we're relevant to infrastructure, as we support clients across the value chain on a number of solutions, whether it's political risk insurance, non-payment insurance, trade credit insurance, and sureties.
Hi all, I'm Ram Shalita from Bluebird. We arrange financing for large infrastructure projects, mainly in Africa. In recent 8-9 years, we arranged something like today, 2.2 billion euro of projects.
Thanks, everyone. So we've got you're spoiled today. We've got a really world-class export credit agency here, probably the best, UCAF. We've got an amazingly active export finance bank, DZ. We've got an insurance broker, Marsh. And then we've got a person who does all the deals and works with multiple banks and ECAs and is extremely experienced on the topic. I'll finish off with myself. Chris Mittman. I'm a co-founder and owner of an impact fund with 2 other individuals, specializing in investing in the 15% commercial tranches of export credit transactions. And we do that by channeling development bank money into those transactions from the likes of European Investment Bank, IDC, DFC, and others. So making it easy for banks to access the 15% if they don't want to do it themselves. So the topic here is quite broad. I'll just make a couple of opening remarks before, but then we're going to ask you questions. So if you've got your Slido polls ready, Gabby, did you tell everyone how that works? Okay. But I don't know how it works, but we'll do it. So, okay, you get to vote soon. It's quite participatory, this, so it should be fun. So I think, just by way of opening remarks, I think we can all agree, if you've been doing export finance for a while, you'll realize that ESG is one of the immemorial hallmarks of export finance. Long before it was ever in fashion or came up. This market has been doing this for longer than it cares to remember. Actually, it doesn't know why it does it. It's been doing it for so long, but it's become very, very good at it. And the reason is these disciplines make it incredibly attractive to investors as a responsible finance source. That's a good thing. You've also got controlled use of funds, long availability and tenors, which also make it attractive for users of the product. I think the question our panel's going to try to address is whether the current ESG hurdles, my head of impact said I should call it, have become too high. She called it ESG sauvage. Has it become too brutal an environment to actually get deals done? Is it hurting us as an industry to try to get transactions done? Are they realistic? And are they increasingly a challenge to delivering projects? And that's what we're going to try to get around. But also, to be positive, whether positive impact, not just risks, are being adequately considered in the analysis. So we're going to start with a few poll questions. So the first one, if we can have that up, please. This could be quite a small sample, but should be even more fun for that result. So if you can see that there. Any A's? Probably not. Could the panel see those questions? So in your experience, are ESG requirements increasing over the last 5 years? No, a little, moderately, or significantly. So, okay, C and D. Then next question, please. The next question is sort of where's it coming from and why? Do we have it up? Ah. So just so you can think about it before it comes on screen, it is, in your experience, where are the changes in these increased ESG requirements coming from? Is it borrowers, EPC contractors, banks, ECAs, or private insurers, all of whom are represented here on the panel today, so you know who to blame? There. So is it? Okay. Right. Banks only now. So if you're not a bank, you don't get to answer. Do you know what the OECD Common Approaches contain and when they were last reviewed and or updated? Okay, that's a pretty resounding no. Banks only did this, probably know the answer to this one now. Did your export finance team comment on the latest draft version of the OECD Common Approaches? And you got a third option there, which is you don't know. Majority don't know. A few, yes. That's good. Okay, great. So I think the reason we want to ask that is because there's some perceptions and there's some realities, and I thought we'd get out some context from the audience first. But I'd like to then ask the panelists, first of all, Gabriela, maybe to comment on opening remarks on the topic. I think it's fair to say you guys have been the leader on this for a while, ESG. So maybe you can talk about the approach UKEF takes on climate sustainability. Do you see it as an enabler or a control or both?
Thank you, Chris. I think before I start answering the question specifically, I think it's really important to clarify what we're talking about when we say ESG, because it's used differently, that phrase, by different people. For us, it can be both a risk management tool, so something that we use to ensure that we're avoiding the worst harms on the ground with the projects that we support. And then that also ensures that we're avoiding legal risks, reputational risks, financial losses for ourselves. And separately, it can refer to sustainable finance or measuring and incentivizing good practices, right? Through sustainability linked loans, green bonds, all those different instruments. And these are not the same thing. They're quite different. For UKEF, to start off, I can talk about how we do our ENS risk management. That's the team that I'm in. And the way we try to ensure that we manage these risks is through implementing the OECD Common Approaches, which is the subject of the question here, and also the Equator Principles, assuming that people are familiar with one or both. But basically, the risk management frameworks, they're similar, one more geared towards ECAs, one more geared towards banks, but they're both underpinned by the IFC performance standards. That means that whether you're using one or the other, if you're actually assessing a project on the ground, you're comparing it or you're benchmarking it against the IFC's performance standards. And those were last updated in 2012. That's more than a decade ago, right? Significantly more than a decade ago. And the IFC's performance standards on sustainability, I think they're called, they represent good practice, not gold plating, but reasonable good practice that was designed to be implementable on the ground with existing technology at reasonable price anywhere in the world. And that was back in 2012. So we're not talking about anything groundbreaking or novel or super new here when we're talking about ESG or ENS risk management. That being said, I do recognize that the landscape has changed and the risks have changed from 2012 to now. So there's emerging risks, particularly climate change, human rights, issues like human rights and modern slavery and supply chains. Those weren't necessarily big in 2012, but they're much bigger now. And we're also getting better at how to implement these standards and these good practices within the banks, within ECAs, and within developers as well. There's more guidance, there's more scrutiny from stakeholders that we face all the time. There's more expectations that we manage these risks. Our stakeholders rightly expect that we're not going to be contributing to things like modern slavery, So that all being said, this stuff, the risk management, is the bedrock for then for a good transaction, and then for thinking about and measuring positive outcomes and impacts, and then looking at sustainable finance, incentivizing good practices, all that stuff, none of it really works if your project is actively causing harm, right? So unless you have a solid risk management in place, and unless you implement that well and you avoid harms, then you're not going to have positive outcomes. You can't have positive outcomes if you're also not avoiding harms. So basically, it all goes back, I think, to getting the basics right. Early identification, management of risks, E&S risks, that will help projects succeed, and the financing will run smoothly, and the projects will be better, and then you can think about the positive impacts as well. In terms of the sustainable finance side, the positive impact side, UCAF is doing quite a bit. On climate, we were one of the first ECAs to have a net zero target. Now we have interim targets on oil and gas, aviation, and the power sector. We're doing quite a bit on sustainable finance to try to develop new projects or new products to incentivize and support the transition. But all of that, it doesn't really work again unless you have a solid risk management in place. So to answer the question, it's both. It's a control in that you have to have a solid risk management to avoid the worst harms, and that's something that is absolutely necessary. And then it's also an enabler in looking at the sustainable finance and the positive outcome side.
Thanks, Gabriella. That's great scene setting. Thank you. Clearly, we are raising the bar on ourselves since 2012. That's certainty. When probably no one knew what an ECA was then. We all know now, that's for sure. So, Cara, your view, your opening remarks, is there a risk the benefits of the OECD modernization, which I think are amazing, are potentially being outweighed now by ESG compliance? And do you think impact is sufficiently being taken into account in this mix?
Thanks, Chris. I think that in the community of E&S practitioners, there's actually a pretty high level of awareness that sort of the framework for assessment has become too complex. For example, a few weeks ago at the Equator Principles annual meeting, an example was used of the mining sector. One of the keynote speakers counted the number of applicable standards in the mining sector and came to the conclusion that there are 22 different standards that could be applied to E&S risk management just in mining alone. And so I think definitely within the EB community, there's awareness of this. And at the OECD as well, the common approaches have been undergoing a revision process since at least 2019. When I was at Euler Hermes, I worked on that, and the revision is still not complete. So as part of that, attempt was made to slim down the common approaches. There was a large discussion about aligning it while making official reference to the Equator Principles. But a consensus hasn't been found yet. So there's still a lot of discussion ongoing with regard to the best way to simplify things. I think everyone is really looking to the IFC at this point. They are also revising their standards, which underlie, as Gabriella just mentioned, underlie both the Equator Principles and the common approaches of the OECD. Really looking to them to just simplify everything. So it's a large responsibility, and we'll have to see what they come up with in the next year or two. I have to second much of what Gabriella said. I think that the focus of banks and insurers in the space traditionally has really been on risk management as the primary objective. Now what we're seeing, especially through LMA, relevant products, et cetera, is more potential for impact. And we are all E&S practitioners in the space are also sort of making an adjustment to considering sort of both aspects. Thanks.
Thanks, Cara. 22, that's a target to aim for, really quite aspirational. Also, for those who didn't respond to the common approaches or provide comments, it's not too late is the message I'm hearing, because they're still being revised. So don't complain about it later if you don't comment now, I guess, is sort of the strong suggestion you need to make your voices heard as banks and practitioners, because you're going to live the dream afterwards once they're adopted. So, Ram, you work, I think I said, with multiple ECAs, banks, multiple countries, building supply chains. It would be really helpful to get your perspective as someone at the coalface of this topic, living the dream day to day, as to what it all means in practice. So do you want to maybe tell us what you're seeing in the area, and is it getting easier or harder?
Yes, hi. First of all, I think it's pity that the audience now, the hall is not full, because definitely the ESG or the ENS sounds boring and so, but this is the #1 topic in the industry today that has a huge influence on what's going on and on my gray hair and the gray hair of many people in the industry, and basic things that must change. From what we see in many deals, and I wrote about it also some article in few magazines, is that this subject has gone way out of proportions in recent 5 years, 2 years especially. I mean, we are talking about enormous time of due diligence on the ENS, which is way, way out of proportions. I mean, for B category projects, water projects, where it should be 4 months, 5 months, today it's easily 1.5 years or 2 years. Second, the costs are becoming unbearable and unrealistic. Instead of 100,000 euro for ENS studies in the past, now it's easily, they add 0, easily 1 million, 1.5 million, and I'm talking not on A category projects, I'm talking even on B. Third is that everything suddenly becomes A. I mean, the letters don't matter anymore. The requirements for B or C projects are almost practically as A, and we see that with all ECAs. Fourth, the result of this is that the guys on the ground who need to do the project and to do the operation, namely for the construction, the EPC, and then the government, just lose track, okay? They lose patience, they lose the ability to understand what's going on, why those requirements are so crazy. And it's becoming, there is the Game of Thrones, so I call it the game of papers. I mean, the ECAs give papers, the government sign, they don't really care, because you lose the ability to understand what's going on and why, for a water project, which should be simple and positive, there are endless policies and managements and ESAPs and ESMFs and all those abbreviations that are understandable maybe in Europe, but much less in Africa. Massive delay in construction, no one talks about it, but today in all the deals that we do, big deals, the first year and a half is wasted because of the studies. You cannot start construction. This has huge implications on everything. No one, almost doesn't care. My point is that over-sustainability is no sustainability. Meaning when you exaggerate too much, you make it an empty word, it becomes laundry, and it loses the effect.
Thank you, Ram. That's quite clear, and also is down in writing as well for those who didn't hear it. It's on the page, so please photograph that. It's a strongly held view, but also, as I said, Ram and Bluebird manage a lot of different projects with a lot of different ECAs. This isn't a narrow view based on experience with one ECA or one bank. So I think we'll come back to the ABCs and making sure they are 3 separate letters and not one, which is Ram's point. Sophie, quite interesting to pick up on this, because obviously the standards here are being held up as being super high, super world-class, or high anyway, in this OECD export credit space. But you structure insurance solutions for a variety of clients, from banks through to DFIs, regional multi. Do you see different standards flowing through and being applying here in these different client bases, or are they all equally as high? It's like the pole vault, or is it hurdles, or is it high jump, or somewhere?
Thanks, Chris. Well, as you said, we do support clients across a wide spectrum. So that's the top level, that's the debt and equity investors, that's MDBs, DFIs, commercial banks. And then you have the equity investors, project operators and owners, and the EPC contractors and suppliers. And from our viewpoint, the majority of deals we are currently seeing in Africa are MDB-led, often with local banks, but not a huge amount of ECA deals. And I think in terms of the deals that are getting done in Africa are the players who take a very pragmatic approach to ESG. And obviously we know that the biggest challenges infrastructure are facing at the moment are supply chain disruptions, climate change, and geopolitics. So for the insurance markets, they take they're very keen to support Africa to enable them to tackle these challenges, so to diversify their economy and to not rely so much on imports. So that heavily relies on the industrialization of their economies, which means financing the big power projects, the extractive industries. And I think that's what the insurers do. So insurers do request ESG information, but it's not exhaustive. They wouldn't expect to see the full reports. But for them, it really, there are questions which impact the risks, but it's more in terms of political risk. So insurers will be keen to know whether there's the environmental licenses in place or land permits, because obviously that could impact how long the government will be supporting that project. But we don't see, insurers don't definitely push a huge amount of requirements on their clients. But I don't know whether that's reflective of just the deals we're seeing, but it definitely seems to be that the majority of business in Africa at the moment is being carried by the regional DFIs, and that could be because they may have more of a flexible approach on ESG. But one thing we'd say in terms of insurers' appetite on ESG, they've got quite a broad, as I say, somewhat pragmatic approach. They all definitely rate deals on ESG, but there's no sort of unified methodology. So each insurer has their own approach, and they'll then report that to their reinsurers. But we're not currently seeing a positive that. We don't see insurers providing necessary discounts on the premium they provide to projects that have a very strong ESG rating, even if that's internal. We do see insurers like Allianz Trade and QBE invest the premium they earn on green-related transactions to green bonds, for example. But what I really like to see in the insurance market is kind of a unified approach where there's how you can rate an ESG project and that actually resulting in a positive impact in terms of your insurance terms, which we're not seeing yet.
Thanks, Sophie. Really interesting. So certainly from our experience as a fund, we talked to over 40 arranging banks, and they approach us on a variety of transactions to see if we can do the uncovered portions of those deals. We're certainly seeing a lot more non-OECD ECA deal inquiries, not from Asia, but from regional ECAs in particular, and development banks being involved, and insurers. I can't comment as to why, but my general view is that banks, like water, follow the path of least resistance when they're trying to close deals. And if there's a resistant way, they go around it and they find another way to do it. So we're back to frameworks. So we heard, Gabriella, that almost no one knew what the common approaches were. Well, someone did in the corner over there. But also no one had commented on them, or they didn't think their organization had. So are these 2012, literally hundreds of years old approaches to blame for the increased requirements, or is it the ECA's interpretation of those or other factors?
Thanks. I'd like to flip this one a little bit. So rather than looking for blame and sort of pitting ourselves against each other, I'd like to flip it a bit and challenge everyone and sort of encourage everyone to remember what the ECAs in implementing the common approaches and the Equator principles are trying to achieve. And this ultimately is avoiding harm, right? Avoiding bad outcomes for people, for the environment on the ground. In the same way that we manage financial crime risks and ABC issues and anti-bribery corruption things, we have the leverage and we have the responsibility to manage ENS risks. And these are real, right? This isn't just some esoteric thing. Ram talked about, on on the face of it, easy projects or simple projects that should be simple faced with increased scrutiny. We've got projects that, on the face of it, should be really good, simple projects, infrastructure, positive things, that unfortunately then in construction end up with multiple fatalities, sometimes multiple fatalities in a single incident. And then this causes actual, harm to not just obviously the loss of life, but it causes construction delays, it causes draw stops, no one is happy when that happens, and nothing is going well when that's happening. So we're trying to take these experiences and all the time we spend trying to remediate those issues in post-issue, which is then taken away from time that we could be spending doing more deals, because we're trying to spend all our time remediating these awful things that are happening post-issue. We're trying to learn from those experiences and avoid that happening in the first place by embedding better risk management at the front end. So again, and this isn't just because we feel like having a moral high ground, although I'm sure there's smug people everywhere in the world. This is because we're also facing scrutiny from our stakeholders. There is a massive amounts of scrutiny on the financial industry now from stakeholders. That wasn't necessarily the case back in 2012 or before. So again, if my team is spending all our time on responding to journalists, responding to FOIs, defending ourselves in judicial reviews, we're not going to have that time to spend, doing business. So going back to the standards, as Kara mentioned, they've evolved. The IFC hasn't, but they're in the process of doing so because they recognize they no longer represent good practice. I mean, their latest update was before the Paris Agreement, so obviously it's very old. So in that space, because it's taken them so long, the Equator Principles has evolved. The OECD Common Approaches has been in a very long, tortuous journey of trying to evolve. To fill in the key gaps left by IFC. Mainly it's on climate change and human rights issues. But the biggest sort of the direction of travel with those two is to try to improve consistency. So we recognize at the OECD level that there is massive inconsistency between the common approaches and the Equator Principles, and banks, we're signed up to both, the projects are trying to implement both, it's not great. So with the OECD, the biggest sort of driver is to try to meet and go to the same level as the Equator Principles so that there's more consistency. I'll also say that the frameworks they're risk management frameworks. They don't set a risk appetite within the banks. We do that ourselves. And we're different. ECAs are different. They're very diverse. And we're obviously very different from banks who are themselves diverse. So everyone will have a different risk appetite and will have a different appetite for taking on more or less risk. And we'll also interpret the standards a little bit differently. There's also an issue of capacity within financial institutions, within our teams to properly interpret the standards. If there's no capacity inside the FI, we're going to overly rely on consultants who don't always give the best advice. There's also capacity issues in that world. So I do recognize all this needs to be improved. The bulk of the effort at the OECD, at the practitioners level and at the EP is on improving that consistency and implementation, on developing more resources so that these frameworks can be implemented the same way, and it's easier to implement them. So there's various working groups dedicated to this. One of the biggest successes, I think, has been recently at the EP level. They've published a guidance note on the use of, on agents, on environmental and social agents. So it's basically, the whole point of that is to try to empower and enable banks to take a lead on the ENS due diligence stream and post-issue to do that so that there is sort of there's a single sort of lead and the roles are better defined and therefore it's more efficient. The whole due diligence process is more efficient inherently. So let's remember, I think there's more than 130 banks that have now signed up to the Equator Principles, and if that gets implemented and operationalized, that could be a really big lever to improve efficiency and consistency in implementation. So to wrap it up, I think rather than focusing on costs and blaming each other and viewing ESG as a barrier, I would really like to encourage everyone to remember the value in implementing good, solid risk management in place, not only to sort of unlock more finance, but to build better infrastructure ultimately.
Thanks, Gabriella. It's 100% understood and heard. I think what I'm hearing also is as an impact fund, we don't lead with ESG. So when we do projects, and Cara, I'm coming to you in a minute to think, ask you if you think the banks are to blame here. Do they have the right people in the teams to drive this process, or should we always hire RAM to do it? So,
No,
but before you do that, I'm just going to say that, not leading you with that question, is that as an impact fund, when we finance a hospital, we don't do it so we can measure the risks of building a hospital. We look at the impact health outcomes of the hospital once it's built. That's the first thing we look at. Flood defenses. We look at road access. What is the impact? Why are we building this? And I think as we're having this discussion, if you have a pendulum, or if you have scales, I can't do that and hold the microphone, but imagine if it's all one side about risk and there's not a counterbalance about positive impact, inevitably the risk is going to weigh heavier on the process, and there's no counterbalance for that. So I think one of the things that we as a fund to propose, and mark your diaries, 8th of December, there will be a webinar arranged by the Burn Union and ICC on measuring and reporting impact, with the idea that the industry can start to have a framework we consistently apply for actually measuring the impact of the projects we do. This is very common in the development bank world, but very uncommon in the export credit world, and maybe somewhat to blame, apart from the banks, for why sometimes things get out of whack or perhaps out of proportion, as Ram would say. Cara, do you want to make it, please?
Sure.
Anything at all? Just
No, I'll respond a bit maybe to what you and Gabriela and Ram have all said. So, as was obvious in the poll, I think the ECAs often take the heat, right, for all these requirements. And, the reality is really that we're all in the same boat, and that applicants for cover or for financing, bear the brunt of the of the work. I really think that banks need to take more responsibility in this space. What I've seen happen working at Hermes, and also since my time at Hermes, is situations where, the exporter is subject to a set of requirements that the ECA has laid out, and the bank sort of steps back and forwards emails. That's all they do in that instance to help manage the task. They provide no technical input, and they provide no support to to their client, to the borrower. And I really think that needs to change. I think that the ECAs, the common approaches is designed to level the playing field, right? It's supposed to be a framework so that all ECAs are assessing ENS aspects to the same standard. And it does function that way, but it's written with a lot of room for interpretation. And, the ECAs are like children with the same parents. They all have their own personalities, and they all interpret that standard in a slightly different way. And, it's not fair in many cases for a borrower or an applicant for cover to have to sort of roll with the punches. I think that ECAs are reasonable, and I think that with the right advisor on the side of the borrower, so the right bank with the right technical ENS capability, the process can go much more smoothly, and the borrower can have a much better experience. So I am a huge proponent for banks to staff up with technical ENS people. There's not that many of us out there, but snap us up, because we're going to help you. Maybe also one other quick thing, just in response to something that Ram said, categorization. I just have to second this. Yes, it seems like these days everything is an A, right? And I mean, looking, let's say 5 years ago, right? You would have a wind park somewhere, right? That would be close to a protected biodiversity area, have significant impacts on birds and bats. That would be an A project, solid A project, right? Now you have that wind park plus 3 other wind parks like it, plus a solar park that are all supplying power to a green hydrogen facility. And that's also an A project. How can those 2 projects be held to the same standard? I think that this categorization needs to be looked at, and the the definition of what constitutes an A project may need to change. So I definitely agree with you there. Maybe I'll stop there.
Nice. Before I ask Ram the next question, just to also give a shout out to the ECAs as well. As a fund which raises funds from development banks, I'm quite used to hearing what they don't want us to do with their money. And the list is quite long and extensive. It's called the exclusions list, and I know it by heart. And each one's got a different exclusions list. So, but when I compare that to the ECAs, when I ring up the ECAs, and I said this in Seville at FFD4, I said, you ring the ECA, can you do sovereign lending in Africa? Yep, I can do that. Can you do project finance? Yep, we can do that. Corporate debt? Yep, we can do that as well. They're quite ambidextrous, whatever it is when you've got more than two hands. Anyway, it's ambidextrous compared to the development bank community. So whilst there's some challenges now, they are as nothing compared to trying to work in the development finance world. Necessarily, though, it's not to blame them because their mandates are all about development impact, and they have very, very strong measurement tools and controls to make sure that is delivered. They're not here to promote trade. So there's still a commercial bone in the ECA's bodies and the banks who help advocate for them. So, but moving on to RAM, you mentioned categorization, everything's an A. How might we strengthen? What practical solutions do you propose, Ram?
Look, first of all, just to say, don't get me wrong. I'm not in the blame game. I'm a practical man. And no one wants to get back to the days of 15 years ago when neighborhoods were deconstructed and people didn't get compensation, and so of course not. But the problem is that then it was 0, and now it's 200. And the truth has to be in the middle. And ECAs have to understand that they need to improve also, and to talk about the elephant in the room. And one thing we see very clearly is the huge gap between what people say on ENS in closed rooms and what they say in such conferences. Huge gap. And I don't accept it. I mean, we need to talk about the problems and to talk clearly about the problems and also the solutions. On the solutions, what we do practically, and we closed the big deals with all of them, not still with UKF, but I hope also with UKF soon, is first of all, as a lesson, to agree at the beginning, not get definition from the ECA, agree on the roadmap for the ENS studies, and to see if it's acceptable also on the EPC and the government, because if not, I tell the ECA, guys, thank you, but you lost the deal. I mean, we'll go to another place in Europe. And it has to calculate the category. B is not an A. B cannot be an A, okay? I had a case in some ECA, I will not mention the name, a very good one, that she said, okay, it's a water project, it seems B, it's great, but I have a presentation to show. And then she put slides with requirements of a AAA. I told her, thank you very much. We are going now to, it was in another city, we'll go to Amsterdam or whatever, because we'll not give the deal to you. I mean, we're not going to do a water project in Ivory Coast if the requirements are AAA. It will not work. If you can get back to maybe to the slide, please.
We've lost the slide with, thank you.
Yes, another way that we implement now practically is to limit in advance, once we have this roadmap, to limit in advance the time and money spent, especially on B projects and so, but also A, spent on ENS studies prior to financial close and after. Meaning, we insist with the ECA that if we have now ESMF, ECA, red flag report, blah, 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 whatever, we will approach the firms and we'll tell them you have 2 months and 50K to do that, not more. Because all those firms today, when they sense 2 months, they say maybe it's 6 months and we'll charge 500. Why? Because we can. No, you cannot. You cannot. So from now on, we define it in the terms of reference. You have 2 months and 50,000. Whoever doesn't want that, it's fine. We'll go to others. In brief, the others. Veto right to the government and to the EPC on main documents. If you have the ESAP or main ES documents, We will not accept anymore dictation from the ECA of how it has to look like. It has to be discussion, dialogue, and the government and the EPC must have some veto on main things here. Another point is to find the way how to do construction in parallel to fulfilling the ES requirements. It's not automatic, it's not mandatory, I understand the sensitivities, but the situation that a year and a half in a project you cannot construct because of ENS is not realistic, is not sustainable. Chris mentioned the other things. The last thing for me, most important, is the competition. This is the leverage that we use, okay? If we see an ECA or a bank that exaggerate, we give the deal to others. There will always be others. The competition is the key to keep it reasonable.
That couldn't be clearer. Thanks, Ram. I know we've got a few questions dropping in, and we're probably not going to get to the end of the agenda, but this has been a good conversation. I think it's fair to say that competition we're beginning to see that emerge. Ram referenced he's able, because he works with multiple ECAs and has he has optionality. Some people have that, some don't. But nevertheless, I think the call is for pragmatism, I think, is what I'm hearing, Ram. And also, some of those things you said seem really practical and should be discussed deal by deal. Why not? Let's give it a go. So, Cara, Lena, any sort of final comments having heard Ram's?
Can I just add a bit on categorization, because I'm going to stir the pot a little bit. I think we focus too much on categorization, and I think a B and an A, there is a massively blurred line there. A high-risk category B is treated the same as an A, as per the Equator Principles, as per the common approaches, probably soon. IFC is going to move to 4 categories soon anyway, so everything's going to change. So, yeah, I think we need to look at the actual project, and rather than saying all Bs, all As, that doesn't drive things for UCAF. We don't really, there's like a couple of really specific things that have to be for an A versus a B, but for the most part, what drives the effort, the time, the cost, is the maturity, the competence, and the willingness of the developer to embed good systems and practices. A category A with a solid ISHA, solid management plans, is going to fly through the due diligence process. Yeah, there'll be a little bit of money spent on an ISC, but let's be real. It's not significant compared to legal costs and other costs of doing business. For a category B, medium risk, maybe not super low risk, but medium risk, some resettlement with a developer that's resisting doing anything, that's going to be torturous. And we're going to spend half our time holding hands and upskilling, rather than just to get to a point where we're vaguely, confident that the process is decent before we can sign. So for me, it's not about the category or what category we assign. It's about just having a good system in place. And companies that have good systems in place, that get this, that embed this at the corporate level and then apply this at projects, they don't have a hard time. That they fly through.
So it's sort of
companies that try to cut corners and then do something badly, and then we have to do it again and again and again. Yeah, that takes a lot more money and that costs a lot more.
So it's also the parties and individuals around the deal as well, not just the frameworks. Lena, anything you want to add before I? Sorry, did I say Lena? I meant Cara. Cara, anything you want to add to that?
Maybe just really quick, I don't want to take too much time. On the category issue, I fully agree. A projects are almost easier to assess than Bs because the requirements are more well-defined and you always have an independent consultant helping you. B project, medium or high risk, you don't always have a consultant, and it's typically the bank and the ECA and the borrower trying to figure out, what burden of proof is there, what documentation do I need, et cetera, et cetera. It's difficult. It's more resource intensive. And that would be one piece of feedback perhaps for the OECD. It would be great to have a clearer framework for assessment of B projects.
This is good. We're in solutioning mode. This is good. And Ram, just to your point that sometimes you're not actually at the table, you're involved in the discussions, but remotely is also your point. Sometimes when you have these ISHA discussions and the SDDs, it's almost between the bank and the ECA. Is that also sometimes the issue in terms of the way? Okay. So, Sophie, so last couple of minutes we've got, you mentioned in our prep panel that this could be an opportunity for Global South, who have more pragmatic approaches to applying ENS. They live in Africa, so they understand the realities, and also they're looking at the other side of the scales a bit. But what are you seeing on that side?
So first in terms of the projects we're seeing, as you said, we're seeing a real shift from players from the global north to the global south, which is great to see. And we're seeing, influx of banks from the Middle East. We're seeing lots of local banks finance deals in sub-Saharan Africa. But just to go back in terms of, with regards to opportunities at ESG, I do agree with Lena and Gabriella that I think there's a huge amount of opportunity, because in the insurance market, we see a huge amount of capacity and support behind multilaterals like Afrexim Bank, AFC, AFDB, etc. But obviously their main goal is to mobilize private capital and bridge this massive financing gaps. They need the OECD players to come in. So where I think there's a great deal of collaboration is to bring in those impact investors who need the kind of all of this criteria that UKEF do a great job of outlining. They can come in. They don't necessarily have the risk appetite to take African risks, but the credit insurance market are happy to do that, behind multilaterals. And so I think this is a great way that we can, we're already doing it already with insured repacks, but to be able to tap into another layer of investors who want those sustainable loans, we can credit wrap them, and then we can mobilize and scale up the financing on deals, especially as well if we can kind of harmonize the way you can categorize projects so they can get a specific scoring that's understood by everyone. I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to get automatic fast follow capacity that will just start ensuring percentage of deals, because it's part of an insurer's ESG strategy. So I do think there's a huge amount of opportunity if we can harmonize the standards.
So we're going to have one short poll to finish, but before we do, just a closing remark. I won't try and summarize the discussion. I think we're all here, heard it. We sort of know it's a combination of things can be brought to bear to make things easier and get projects realized. But just to remind myself and everyone in the room that ours is the first ever, ECAs is the first ever impact fund set up to invest in the export credit, 15% tranches of export credit transactions. That wasn't a light, flippant thing to do. We could have chosen any number of markets to deploy Fund 1. And that's because, frankly, and we know it because we've spoken to over 670 investors so far, most of whom had never heard of export finance, the disciplines, both ESG as well as others and controller funds that exist in the market, are very, very attractive to people wishing to deliver impact in the Global South. There is no question. So it remains a massive opportunity for the market to attract more funding in because of those disciplines, but also make sure we work on the disciplines so they don't actually get in the way of doing deals. We're also busy designing Fund 2. We're that excited about the opportunity. So can we have the last audience poll, please? How is the current geopolitical environment impacting your organization's importance attached to ESG and impact? And we all know why we're asking that question. Yeah. Definitely. I wouldn't have expected an increase, but yeah, that's pretty telling. Very good. So without further ado, sorry we didn't get to the audience questions. We ran out of time, but please join me thanking the panel.